Cousin Ruth was playing waltzes for the young folks. Near her stood John Graham, one of her old beaux. He had lately come home for an absence of 20 years. John was looking at Ruth with apparent concern, counting the lines that began to mark her pale face and noting the streaks of gray that ran through her hair. It had been so dark and thick the last time he had seen it. Then he gazed thoughtfully at the merry young dancers, and at last, feeling that he ought to say something, asked, "Who is the graceful yellow-haired girl?" "That is Grace Deering, Cousin Tom's daughter," Ruth replied. Her hearer exclaimed wonderingly, "Tom Deering's daughter? I remember him so well." After a pause, he added, "I thought you and he would have been married long ago." Cousin Ruth smiled, shook her head, and played on without speaking. "The last time I saw you," said John musingly, "you were waltzing with Tom himself. Do you remember it?" Did she recall it? 20 years had passed since young Jack Graham had bidden her a cold and brief farewell, and she, amazed and awestruck by his manner, had merely said goodbye and let him go. Yet the memory of that night had never left her. "I wonder why Ruth is playing that old-fashioned waltz," said the elders of the party to each other, and John Graham listened spellbound to the well-remembered strain. "Ah," he said suddenly, "the tune recalls the past. I sent you a bunch of violets that very night and hoped that you would wear them. Oh, Ruth, what a heartless flirt you were." Old as John had grown, his eyes were a familiar expression as they met hers. As soon as the young people had tired of dancing, Cousin Ruth went up to her room and locked herself in, giving way to strange emotion. From the lowest depths of her trunk she took an old brass-bound box that had not been disturbed for 20 years. Unliking it, she hastily raised the lid. Instead of the fresh, sweet violets she had left in it, there were a few crisp, shapeless, and withered petals, beneath which for the very first time she discovered a bit of paper, on which were these words: "Once for all, Ruth, is it yes or no? If yes, wear these violets at the ball tonight. I go away tomorrow, and if it is no, I shall not return. J.G." For a few minutes Ruth stood motionless. Clasping the little missive, she went downstairs. One of her nephews, passing her in the hallway, thought how pretty she must have been when she was a girl. Her face was aglow with an unusual beauty. She went into the sitting room where John Graham sat alone. He was gazing moodily at the embers of the fire. Ruth approached and, putting the piece of yellowed paper gently into his hand, said calmly, "I never saw it until this instant." He looked at her in mute astonishment as she was about to turn away. "Would you have worn my flowers had you found the note?" he asked hurriedly. "Ah, Ruth, is it now too late?" The merry voices in the next room drowned her answer to all but John Graham. He alone heard it. This has been Dead Letter Office by Isabel Smithson, published in Short Stories, a magazine of select fiction, Volume 11, 1892, narrated by Conan Stewart, for Tales Reawakened on YouTube.